I want to welcome everyone. I'm very excited to bring to you today Donuts and Diversity on why does the word feminism generate disdain. We are very, very excited to have with us two facilitators. And as previously mentioned, if you were here already, they are in no particular order other than alphabetic. So we are equally excited to have them both and equally thankful to them both. So I'm going to spend just a second providing you a little bit of background about both of them. And then at that point, I will turn it over to them and let them speak. First, we have Dr. Deidre Popovich. She's an assistant professor of marketing in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. She earned a PhD in marketing from Emory University and an MBA from Vanderbilt University. Her research focuses on consumer psychology, including how decision contexts and information cues can influence consumer decision-making and self-control. Her research has appeared in the journals such as the Journal of Consumer Psychology, Journal of Retailing, and Behavior Research Methods. Her previous industry experience includes working as a marketing research manager for a national nonprofit organization and as a strategy consultant for a top 10 healthcare consulting firm. So, Dr. Popovich, welcome. We also have Dr. Jocelyn Bartram Scott. She is a visiting assistant professor of women's and gender studies at Texas Tech University. Dr. Scott earned her PhD in gender studies from Indiana University in 2018. She is an expert in feminist and queer theory, critical race theory, and critical femininity studies. Her work can be found in the Journal of Lesbian Studies and Psychology and Sexuality. She is currently working on her first monograph, Womanly Always, Feminist Tensions, Privileged Positionalities, and Sorority Sisterhood, and guest editing a forum for the Journal of Autoethnography. So I want to take this moment to say thank you to both of you. I'm very excited about today. For everyone who's ready to participate, this will be an interactive session. So until you are ready to speak, please make sure that you're muted. And when it isn't in an interactive activity, if you do have a question, please feel free to send it through the chat and I will communicate that to them. So with that, I turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you so much, Andy. Andy and Kirsten do such a great job organizing these events and expanding our diversity initiatives in the college. So I just want to be sure and thank them for inviting us today and doing such a great job of organizing this. So today we want to have kind of an interactive discussion. So if you feel more comfortable, typing your comments in the chat, you're more than welcome to do that. If you feel like raising your hand and putting your microphone on, we're also happy to have some verbal discussion as well. But today we want to talk about the word feminism and gender equity and some other important topics. So we have an agenda for today. We have a PowerPoint just to kind of keep us on track. But again, we want this to be fairly interactive and we do want your feedback. So we're going to talk about what is feminism, why is feminism often construed as a, quote unquote, dirty word. We had some feedback prior to our presentation, so we wanted to make sure and address this point. Why do we still need feminism? And what are some suggestions to help increase gender equity? Mainly we'll be talking about this in the workplace, but also, in society as a whole. So what is feminism? Does anybody know? Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on what they think this construct is?
And don't be shy. I've heard it all.
Okay, I'll go. This might be completely off, but I feel like it's just what we define it as, like each of us, women. So it can be different for everybody.
Okay, yeah. So what I hear you saying is that there isn't like one specific kind of threshold or marker of, you must believe in X or you must do X to be a feminist. Yeah, I think that's definitely one component. Yeah, I see some things coming through in the chat. Support of women, equality, everyone should have the same opportunities, viewed as equal, visibility to women. Yeah, I think all of these are definitely definitely in the realm of the working definition we're going to be using. Are there any other comments people wanted to add? Advocacy of women. Yeah, I like that one. Anything else people wanted to add?
I'll comment. I think that a lot of times when we think about feminism, we think about it differently than how we interpret what to be a feminist is. And so feminism tends to be, all the stereotypes for, when we think about being identified as a feminist, that's looking at equality, economically, socially, and things like that.
Just for the record, I did not share this PowerPoint with Lauren prior to the presentation, but she's leading us right into where we're going with this. So we're going to talk about, you're amazing. We're going to talk about the definition a little bit more, and then we are going to address some of these stereotypes. As you mentioned, I think there are some certain opinions about what feminists are and what they do. So Dr. Scott, if you'd like to discuss feminism a little bit more, since you're the women's and gender studies expert, I wouldn't mind.
Sure. I mean, I think the definition is actually pretty simple. It's just basically the belief in equity for everyone, regardless of gender, and equity in all ways. So social, economic, political, and any other way you can think of. And particularly, I would say right now, from more the academic side, there's definitely an expectation that this is, of course, not limited just to understanding issues of equity related to gender, but also how those issues interact with other aspects of our social position of our lives, things like our class status, our race and ethnicity, our religion, our ability and disability status, our sexuality. So absolutely, you all are on the right track. I like all the specific dimensions that you brought up, recognition of the struggles that women of the past have faced. I think that's really significant to thinking about that feminism is absolutely how we got to where we are today in terms of any progress that's been made. Absolutely. But also, as Dr. Popovich alluded to, that there is still quite a distance in front of us to go in order to actually get to true equity. So these are some key takeaways that Dr. Popovich has put up on the screen for y'all. Just basically belief in equity of all people. Everyone should have equal opportunities, equal rights, equal access, and that it's about equity. It's not necessarily about sameness, which we can get into a little bit more if people are unfamiliar with that kind of differentiation. And it's certainly not about, as we get into the stereotype section, it's certainly not about a belief that women are superior to men or anything like that, although it is sometimes misconstrued and misused in that way.
And Dr. Scott and I also, talked about the difference between equity and inclusion, and equity and equality when we were preparing these slides. So equality is giving people access to equal opportunities. Equity is making sure that everyone's on the same playing field. And so those are also kind of different but related constructs that it's important to keep in mind that we really are talking about equity when we talk about feminism. So Lauren, here are some of your stereotypes that you alluded to, that there is definitely a difference between the definition of feminism in terms of advocating for equity and some of these stereotypes that exist. So we also wanted to get the audience to participate here and let us know, what are some stereotypes that you think are perpetuated when we think about feminists?
This is my favorite part. So one that I hear often when I teach about this is ball busters, hate men, also hate families, don't want women to, all of these different things.
Yeah, y'all are coming up with a lot of really good ones, really common ones in the chat. So that feminists hate men, that feminists kind of are out of touch, or they are, they're overreacting, want to be men, right? Are bad women, unsuccessful women in lots of ways, unattractive, can't find a partner, must be a lesbian, angry. yeah, believe that women are superior and want to, belittle men, put them down. Yeah, definitely. Hating anything traditional. Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of, that encapsulates a lot. Yeah, because a lot of the things Erica brought up as well, hating families, hating children, all things like that. Yeah, anything kind of traditional, hating that. Yeah. Any other stereotypes people have encountered? And again, don't be shy. I literally have heard all of them.
So when we say traditional, what does that mean? That we're advocating for like going back to the 1950s kind of housewife ideal? Is that what traditional means?
I think traditional is, anything that whatever area possibly of the country we're living in, when we're doing something different than that, possible social norm. So if anybody's living in Lubbock right now, and I'm assuming most people are, right now there's a vote on the table in regards to abortion access. So, as a feminist, you can make a choice, to support women and try to educate people about why they should, support that type of access. So that's challenging a lot of social norms here, which are, obviously possibly religious based. And I'm not trying to offend anybody, but I do think it's important that we have that conversation. But I think a lot of people who identify as feminists are like, oh, then you just think everybody should have an abortion. And it's like, well, okay. I think people should have a choice. And then I think just having a seat at the table, I work with in a predominantly female environment, but I've worked on teams with men. And so I'm comfortable using my voice at the table, and I can see reactions from men that I don't see from women. And that doesn't mean I just like men. I like men, but I just have noticed they're like, whoa, what's happening right now? She's pretty opinionated. And it just turns out that if I have an idea that I think is useful, I'm going to share it.
Yeah, I think that was a really helpful example, Lauren. Thank you. And I think one way that we see this playing out is actually, and we'll get to this a little bit later in the presentation, but is this conflation of structural forms of discrimination, so structural sexism or patriarchy, and individual people. And so just because you are critical of sexism as a structure that discriminates against people that are not men, that does not mean that you are not romantically interested in individual men, because those two things are not the same. And so I think that is, that's one common source of this. And so that's also how we see people also kind of surprised when you hear someone who maybe is a stay-at-home mom and identifies as a feminist, or is whatever it might be, is having a big, wedding, and people are like, you can't be a feminist. Yeah, this whole idea, it's often about this kind of fundamental misunderstanding of what it is feminism is critiquing. And although, of course, we critique the internalization of these biases and power structures, fundamentally, it's a structural critique. Identifying someone as a feminist as a warning label or as a kind of as a negative. Yeah, absolutely. I think in general, one way to sum it up, and Dr. Popovich has anticipated exactly what I was going to say, is that oftentimes it's just negatively associated. When if this is a helpful construct, I believe it's Gloria Steinem who kind of famously said, if you're a woman, you only have two choices, feminism or masochism, because the system is set up to be discriminatory. And so feminism is just a call to attention and call to action to critique that system and, work to change it. And so certainly there's nothing there should not be something inherently negative about it. And yet that it is often considered a dirty word because of all of the stereotypes that go along with it.
Yeah, there's a lot of good comments coming in, so we really appreciate your feedback. Keep it up because we want this to be interactive. And this is kind of my domain, right? I'm the psychologist. So, Dr. Scott will say, well, there's all these, structural biases in place and all these structural systems that are perpetuating sexism. But I would also add as a psychologist that from the evolutionary psychology perspective, our brains are very hardwired for certain things. And this comes from our days as cave people, when we literally had to have our brains wired this way in order to survive, in order to perpetuate the human race. And so some of this hardwiring, you can imagine, would be very helpful when we're trying to stay alive. But it turns out it's kind of maladaptive in today's modern society. And I think a great example of this is the fight or flight response. And it's why we're all, especially in a pandemic, in this constant state of stress, because our brains are hardwired to feel this way. But in terms of, I think, racism, sexism, kind of some of these issues, social inclusion is a really important piece of our society, and it was important when we were cave people. It's important now. We have this very strong need for social inclusion. And so my perspective on this is, whenever you have a social movement of people saying, Black Lives Matter, and the typical response to that is, well, all lives matter, right? And that always irritates me when I hear people say all lives matter, because it's like, well, of course. I mean, you could say, of course, all lives matter. But also it's minimizing the fact that there is a subgroup of our population that is being disproportionately affected by the way our society is structured. And it's minimizing that. But I think people who are not in that subgroup see that as exclusionary. They see that as, oh, well, I'm not Black, so my life matters too. Well, that's, I think, the hardwired response to that social movement, but it's not the constructive response to that social movement. The constructive response to that is, these are people who are seeking inclusion. They want in the inner circle of access and opportunity and resources. And in the case of Black Lives Matter, they want basic human needs like safety to be met. So we as a society really need to try to turn off that hard wiring in our brains as much as possible and look at this from a bigger perspective. And I think the same thing applies with feminism, right? Like, oh, well, here's people who are saying, only women are important. That's not, we've established hopefully already that that's not what feminism is, but that's how it gets construed, I think. And this is also, the reason why implicit bias is really hard to break. You can have implicit bias training, but because this is so hardwired in our brain, we need more than like a half-day training to overcome these very strong biases that we have, where we see others as bad, quite frankly.
Can I jump in and add something really quick, Dr. Popovich? I meant Absolutely. To add also, in our description of feminism, if this is something y'all have encountered before, let me just tell you up front, right? Sometimes people will say, oh, but what about things that disproportionately impact men? For example, men are more likely to die by suicide than women, right? Feminism is still absolutely concerned with this, because structural sexism, patriarchy, and in particular, the constraints of masculinity expectations are one of the main driving forces behind this disproportionate loss of life that is very gendered, right? So absolutely, feminists are concerned with issues that impact men. Full stop. I wanted to add that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, because there's also the issue of toxic masculinity in our culture, right? That men are supposed to behave a certain way, similar to how women are supposed to behave a certain way. And both of those are concerning and need to be addressed, for sure. That's a great point. Any other comments or questions about this before we move on? I know that's not a women's and gender studies perspective on this, but I think it's helpful for us to think about the hardwiring that we have in our brain and how we really have to work very consciously and deliberately to overcome some of these biases that we have. So given that, we have all of the basis of what is feminism and why is sexism still a thing? Why is racism still a thing? Why do we still need feminism? I pulled one slide to illustrate this. I could have obviously pulled 500 additional slides to illustrate this, but this is basically looking at the percentage of private company directors by gender in recent years. And I think also an important topic to think about is the proportion of board members by gender. And these are in venture-backed private companies, but we could have pulled, public companies, we could have pulled, a different subset. But I think this is very illustrative that, we still need to think about gender inequity, and we still need to think about feminism, because we do have these systemic inequities across different sectors of society. And so, maybe we're making a little bit of progress in getting additional women to lead companies and be on and serve on boards, but we still have obviously a very long way to go. And there's debate about, should we require a specific proportion of women on different boards? Should we encourage this? Like, how do we help address these kinds of issues?
Yeah, and I just want to echo what Dr. Popovich said. We could have chosen any aspect of society and really, demonstrated how sexism continues to play a role there, and there are gender inequities there. So certainly, although we're, focusing in on more of the business dimension today, we don't want anyone to walk away thinking that business is the only place in need of this intervention, of course. And so if you have any questions about other specific areas, we're happy to, point y'all towards some resources around those specific areas as well, maybe closer to the end, when we talk about next steps to take to improve gender equity.
So if you don't mind, Dr. Scott, I'd love it if you could share your perspective on, what is the difference between implicit bias and structural inequality, and both of these things are at play, and so we have to deal with both of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So the simplest explanation is that to have structural inequality, you need both a bias or prejudice, and you also need power. So if you think of something like racism, normally in the way we discuss this topic in our culture in particular, we talk about racism as an individual problem, an individual person holding biased beliefs. Okay. Certainly, there are people who hold individually biased beliefs. This is true. When we're talking about structural racism, we are talking about that bias system, so the bias that, white people are superior, plus institutional power. So something like the war on drugs is a great example. This has lots of racial bias built into it in terms of things like differing sentencing for similar drugs that break down around racialized and class lines. The classic one a lot of people bring up is cocaine and crack. You could also think about some of the regulations that were around being within a certain number of feet of other previously incarcerated people, and the knowledge that police officers could intentionally target particular areas, where then we see an over-policing of, not coincidentally, disproportionately areas of color, lower socioeconomic status areas, and then more people, therefore, violating this regulation around being close to or living with or interacting with previously incarcerated persons, because more people there are going to jail, right? It goes on and on and on. So that's a great example of that difference between structural and individual. The individual officer who maybe is engaging in this this targeted policing may or may not have a bias that they feel very strongly about in terms of race, but certainly they are engaging in a form of structural discrimination, because there's that power. And similarly, a judge, right? A judge may or may not then have an individually biased belief system, but then is in a system that has been set up to perpetuate racism, and is then, sending people of color to jail at disproportionate rates for a disproportionate amount of times, for similar crimes, right? So I think that's a really clear example of where we see this happening. Of course, police brutality and all of this, which has been in the news much more lately, is another kind of classic example of this. And so that's also why when people bring up this idea of something like reverse racism or reverse sexism, when we say that's not possible, it's not because an individual person can't have any type of bias that they want you can. It's that difference between the individual bias and that structural discrimination. So that's the key difference. An individual person could be biased against white people, could be biased against men, but there is not that structural arm of social power, institutional power that is set up by design to discriminate against people based on those aspects of identity. Of course, people are not singularly dimensioned people also, of course, right? So a man of color is not being discriminated against by his manness, but certainly by his race, right? Okay, so that's a really key difference. So where we see them coming a little bit more together, where it gets more complicated, is with this framework of implicit bias. And basically, again, kind of the simplest way, I think, to break this down is to think that not only do these structures of power exist, but they are set up and we are socialized to believe them to be normal. So rather than constantly seeing them at work, seeing, racism at work, we just we are socialized to believe them to be kind of natural. And so because of that, we internalize some of these biases by design. And that's one way that we see so many people who, to continue with this structural racism example, I think the vast majority of people who benefit from structural racism, so that would be white people, I think the vast majority of white people in today's world do not hold a particular racialized bias against people who are not white. I genuinely think that. And yet we are all socialized to internalize these biases, to not think about something like, why am I never, pulled out of line at the airport for extra checks, for example, right? We just kind of naturalize these things. And another maybe clearer way to think about it, a metaphor that I really like, if this is new information to you, there's a feminist theorist named Sarah Ahmed who I think has really an ideal metaphor for this. She talks about that based on various aspects of your social position, you either do or don't encounter various walls in front of you to try to do certain things. So I'm going to continue with this police example. Let's say you get stopped by the police, right? I hit a wall at night. You get stopped by the police at night. I maybe hit a wall where I am concerned that this person I'm alone, that may enact violence against me, sexual violence. But I'm certainly not afraid in any acute way that they are going to shoot me. That's not a fear that I have, right? That's not a wall I'm encountering. By contrast, someone who, like a white man, for example, may encounter neither of those walls, right? And so then when we say, hey, there are these walls, other people are saying there was no wall there, right? I just had that interaction. I just got stopped by the police. There is no wall there. And that's really the difference, is that if you're either hitting the wall or you're not. And so it takes a lot more work to try to see the walls other people are hitting, because of course you're not encountering them. And so I think this is, all of these components really demonstrate there is an overlap between implicit bias, structural inequality. Of course, we internalize biases that are naturalized in the world, whether we want to or not, right? But that also is the key point of departure between this idea of kind of reverse structural inequalities. I'll pause there and see if anybody has additional questions or wants additional kind of clarification or additional examples about that, because I think it's a bit of a big concept.
I have a request. Given that most individuals within this community or the audience that we have today are working within an administrative or sort of an academic community, could you provide an example of implicit bias and structural inequality from a feminist perspective through the lens of an academic institution, whether that be faculty or whether that be staff or even students for that matter?
I think the structural inequality that we encounter in academia is that the whole system was set up for men, predominantly white men, to be successful in that environment. And one of the ways that is clearly demonstrating itself, especially during the pandemic, is that women are not publishing as much as they used to because they have these other responsibilities at home, childcare, taking care of a household, all of these things. When academia was set up, it was set up for a man with the assumption that that man had a wife at home who would take care of all of those responsibilities. I mean, it's very clear that this is how the system has been set up. And so if you're not a man with a partner at home taking care of those responsibilities, then you are running into these walls. And I think the wall metaphor is so powerful because if you're not the person running into the wall, you don't see the wall. But the people who are running into the wall experience the wall all the time. And they're trying to explain to people who don't see the wall, there's a wall here. And the other people are saying, no, there's not, right?
Yeah. And so I really like to go to like deep dive into metaphors. So just, that's what you're in for today, right? Another, metaphor I really like, is there's an anti-racist, activist and speaker who talks about that, structural racism is basically raining on us all the time. But the problem is that many of us don't, and so the same is true of all the forms of structural inequality, but that only those who are experiencing the discrimination kind of realize it and then have to point out to everyone else, we're soaking wet, we're in the rain, and they don't, and we don't all necessarily see it. It has to be brought to our attention. So yeah, I think it's really evident. Yeah, I like that from the chat. Yeah, it's not a poison in the air. Yeah, it is the air. Yeah, it is the air itself. And also, I wanted to go back to something that was brought up in the chat earlier. The idea of structural privilege often gets kind of misconstrued as some type of like value metric or a moralistic judgment about people. This is like not an accurate understanding of this concept. It really, at its basis, just means that you're fundamentally, whatever aspect or aspects of your life that you are in the dominant or a privileged group, that you are not experiencing barriers based on that aspect of your identity. That's what it means. So it does not mean anything about your particular work ethic. It does not mean anything about your about your value system. It just is a way of describing either you're encountering these walls or you're not. And yeah, to offer another example of within the academy, yeah, I saw a lot come through in the chat that are really very on point. There are discrepancies at the level of tenure, certainly even greater discrepancies at the level of full professor. In COVID, we're absolutely seeing people, leaving the academy in mass in a very gendered way, partly due to caretaking responsibilities. We certainly know that in some fields, it's even harder to recruit and retain women because of some of the expectations maybe within those fields. We know that there is explicit bias within teaching evaluations. We know that, and we can also think about even something as simple as maternity leave, right? The fact that there isn't a kind of universal understanding of what maternity leave should look like in the academy, I think demonstrates that it was just set up with a different type of body in mind, one that does not have extended periods of time that you might not be able to go to work. And also the treatment of maternity leave, I think, is always your kind of knee-jerk reaction, or anything that you've encountered or heard colleagues encounter around that, being asked in interviews whether you plan to have children, compared to, which of course is illegal, but people still absolutely do it, being asked about that based on your gender identity and gender expression, compared to, I think that I hesitate to think that anyone who, for example, were in a serious accident, for example, and had to miss a large quantity of work would encounter that same type of pushback of, are you really dedicated to your job here? Because of course it's silliness to think that it's silliness that we do that around health ever. Yes. Yeah, so this is hopefully this slide has also cleared things up in our description. So that image is of redlining. If people are unfamiliar with that, the short version is basically that it is and was a way of codifying racial discrimination and class discrimination into lending practices, and so it is a component, certainly not the only one, that leads to where we see the huge gap between what some people call like white wealth and black wealth, but in general, home ownership rates, generational wealth, all these types of things. So yeah, that's a great example of the structural component. So there was a discriminatory bias then put into an institutional practice.
Neighborhoods were classified in a very racist way if you go back and look at the original documentation, in terms of talking about Orientals and Negroes, and that actual language was in the banks when they were trying to figure out which neighborhoods would be able to get a loan and which would not.
Right. And then, of course, we see that continuing to play out today in terms of, we have a public education system that is funded basically based on the value of your community. And we know that clearly there's a large history of devaluing communities where there are predominantly people of color. So, of course, this is not only an issue of the past, although today people may not use it as explicit of language, clearly not only a historical problem.
Right, but it has implications for a lot of things when we talk about, again, access. Can you access healthcare resources? Can you access educational resources? Can you access financial resources? Like, all of these things are still, I think, being impacted by these original, very discriminatory practices. Because which neighborhood you live in has a lot to do with what you have access to. Okay, so hopefully we've established that sexism is still something we need to work on. We've also given a lot of examples today, actually, in terms of racism, I think because, again, as Dr. Scott mentioned, it's so prevalent in the news right now, and there's so much going on in terms of hopefully more cultural awareness regarding some of these issues. So let's have some time to discuss what are some suggestions that would help us increase equity as it pertains to gender. So does anybody know what this picture represents by any chance? Yes, Erica.
Is this an audition and it's de-identified so they don't know who's auditioning, so that they can review the applicant or the performer without knowing who they are, what their gender is?
That is an outstanding description of what is happening in this picture. So we have the review committee who's going to decide who makes the orchestra, who is qualified to be on the orchestra. And in order to make this process a little more fair, a little less unbiased, we put up a black curtain. And so hopefully the committee cannot have any inkling of, as Erica mentioned, what is the gender of this performer? Hopefully they can only hear the performance and not make any inferences about gender or race or any other social factors that might come into play here. And I think one study showed that after committees started implementing these practices, magically more women were able to be on the orchestra.
Well, and Deidre, I'll add too, they did find a little bit of change, and then they started putting down carpets because they could hear high heels. And so then once they did that, the study that I read, it went up by 20% that women were more likely to move on to the next round. And so there's some really good, the symphony's been doing this well for a little while. So that de-identifying for objectivity is really, like, we do see statistical change when that happens.
Oh, so it's not magic. I was under the impression it was just a magical thing that happened. No, I appreciate you telling me about the carpet as well and the high heels, because I think that's also very helpful in terms of making sure we're not making inferences about someone's gender. And I think so I find that example of the symphony so powerful because it does increase equity so much in terms of who's being represented on the orchestra. But I think, we can use some of these similar practices, right, in terms of making hiring decisions, making promotion decisions. One thing that I think is incredibly helpful, similar to the orchestra example, is trying to have blind hiring practices, which means you're going to block out the name of the person who's applying for the job and have access to their credentials. And again, this allows you to not make any inferences about what is the gender of this person, what is potentially the race of this person. And we want to keep this process, both the process of hiring and the process of promotion, as objective as possible. Obviously, when you go up for promotion, people at that point know who you are and know what your gender is and that sort of thing. But making these processes more objective, I think, goes a long way in trying to help increase equity.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Another really tangible example, some people might be familiar that the US is actually the worst country in the world, in the industrialized world / global north, in which to be pregnant and give birth in terms of infant and maternal mortality. And that is it's even disproportionately worse for, women of color, Black women specifically. And one kind of similar, not ridiculously difficult change that California implemented was in order to help mitigate some of the internalized gendered and racialized biases that we see happen in medicine, particularly around pain and particularly around labor and delivery, was that they implemented a practice where they weighed the bandages basically that were used for women after giving birth. And if they weighed a certain amount, indicating a certain level of blood loss, they automatically got an intervention or an additional check or whatever it might be. And they saw a huge decrease in the number of deaths and also of the number of at the level of urgency with which people were finally getting any type of intervention. And so again, I think it's about, did those individual doctors and nurses and PAs and whoever else might have been interacting with them have, a racialized and gendered bias that they really wanted to enact? And I genuinely don't think so. I don't think people tend to go into medicine because they have some type of goal of, harming certain aspects, certain demographics of our population. But we have these stereotypes around different portions of the population and medical access. And we know that they have real tangible results. And so I think that in terms of outcomes and in terms of death. And so I think that, there are so many of these just small changes that can start to make a bigger impact, and then also really bring attention again to those walls that some people are encountering. And I think that's the most important step, is to even recognize that these biases are built in. Because until we do that, we can't ever work to kind of unravel them.
Yeah, that example is also so great because even Serena Williams encountered problems with her delivery. And I mean, here's a high-powered tennis star who they didn't take her pain seriously. I think we were talking about the academy a little bit earlier. And so, some of these more objective type of decision-making criteria can also apply to the academy. This idea of blind hiring, where we need to decrease recruitment biases, even if we can get more women in a candidate pool in the different stages of interviewing, then that helps increase the odds that a woman will be hired for that position. Another couple of suggestions from this particular article were addressing some of the ideas that Dr. Scott talked about, where we need to better address family issues, medical leave, paid leave policies, and access to childcare after the female faculty member gives birth. Yes, Andy.
Yeah, so I saw Claudia's comment, and I was wanting to see if you could address that for a minute. That was one of the things I was thinking of earlier in your prior slide. Could you go back one? Thank you. No, yeah, that way. Thank you. So I think sometimes for me, it's trying to figure out when I'm trying to approach or trying to discuss the idea behind sort of a structural sexism, where it actually begins, right? So while I think that hiring and screening, like having anonymous screening for hiring is important, I think one of the problems with that is that the applications may in all actuality not be equal regardless of how we examine them, because we know that there's research that finds that females, when they're PhD students, don't have the same access to mentoring. Even if they have a mentor, they don't spend the same amount of time with those mentors. They don't have the same introductions as their male counterparts. We know that when students are young and they're in high school, that female students are often not encouraged into things like certain areas like STEM programs, not encouraged to participate in ways that they might express that they're interested in. So I think even if we do, which is wonderful, we definitely should have, sort of blind application processes and such. But I think even at that point, that won't fix a lot of what we need. So I think from an academic standpoint, I'm very concerned about what we can do within the Rawls College or what we can do at Texas Tech University. And those are important, but we have to keep in mind that won't fix the structural problem that goes back so much further than that.
No, I think that's an amazing point. And so well said, because obviously, we're offering a few suggestions here and there for various issues, but it really has to be a multi-tiered, multi-pronged approach at every level. As you mentioned, secondary school, even probably going back as far as kindergarten, probably female students have been treated differently than male students. And so some of these issues are applicable to maybe jobs that you all have. Some of the things might be applicable to people who work in other fields. We have a healthcare example that was given. We had, some hiring examples that were given, but certainly, yes, we need to address these at all levels. And to your point, it is difficult when you have these structural biases baked into a system, because even if we're talking about potentially hiring more women, then we have to address the issue of promoting enough women. And is this really a hiring issue? Possibly not. If we only have 3 female full professors in the entire business school, this is possibly not a hiring issue, right? So then we have to think about, well, how do we address the tenure and promotion issue? And if we don't have enough women to serve on committees and make those evaluations, then that further perpetuates that problem, right? So we have, at all levels, we have issues where if we don't even have the base level representation of enough women to serve on these committees and do this type of work, then we're already at a disadvantage, right? So we've got to figure out various ways to help address this, as you mentioned, at all kinds of levels and in multiple different ways. I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just add quickly. I think it was Claudia, to your kind of initial framing in terms of hiring. Although absolutely, I want to echo what Dr. Popovich said. We have these problems at every single level, and they certainly don't. By the time we are at the level of evaluating someone as a candidate, they have already been. I really like that terminology. Yeah, I mean they're experiencing having been baked into a system that they are already the product of these disproportionate mentoring opportunities and things like that as well. So certainly, yeah, people are not on equal footing when they are at the level of an applicant for a faculty job. So absolutely, I want to echo that. But I would say one thing would be to really challenge that there is one aspect, and particularly is the aspect that disproportionately men tend to have more opportunities, mentorship, access, and success in accomplishing. And that's the only dimension that matters for hiring. Now, understand we're at an R1 institution. Of course, research is going to matter quite a bit. But we also know that, for example, all the research shows that women both do and are penalized for not doing more service work, for example. And so I think, although, of course, I'm not advising anyone to hang your hat on getting a job because you did such tremendous service work. Absolutely not, especially not when we have the types of expectations we do and rewards or not that we don't really have for doing that successfully. I would say that it's to start recognizing some of the other areas where often women candidates might actually be stronger, and trying to value them at all. maybe they are not going to be able to be valued as much as how many publications someone has, but let's bring them in onto the table at all as something that is of value for bringing in a full candidate. Because of course, also we know no one gets to just do their research all of the time, right? You still are going to have to interact with students. You're still going to have to serve on, committees and things like that. So you need to be competent in all areas. So certainly we shouldn't, there's no real reason to evaluate someone based only on one area when that's not going to be the entirety of their job. So I would say that that's one thing we can try to do, is bring competency in multiple areas to the table as an expectation, to maybe devalue that as the only deciding factor.
And going back to this theme of more objectivity in decision making, which I still think is so critical here for trying to reduce these biases, even something as simple as keeping track and making it transparent who's doing what in the department. I mean, there's no reason we can't do that. There's no reason we can't say, look, we have a report that shows women are disproportionately doing more service than men. Maybe we should actually address this. That would be an objective metric that would be easy to figure out, and we could then move on from there. I think some of these things, again, multi-layers, faceted approach to all of these things. And I think, again, if I can return to this article, which I think is helpful, because all of these suggestions have actually been implemented at different universities also. This isn't just some pie in the sky, we should be doing these things. Some universities actually are doing these things. And so having more access to quality childcare, having mentorship was mentioned as a big one, that, females often don't have access to mentors the way that male faculty and male PhD students do. So I think, really thinking through how do we kind of try to provide, similar levels of mentorship across genders, addressing evaluation biases. I think we sort of touched on this in terms of teaching evaluations. We know from the, tons of research that has been done that women are, disproportionately affected by teaching evaluations, and not in a good way. One suggestion was to have some sort of bias correction for these things. Another suggestion that other schools have implemented is just don't use them. There's no reason students can't fill out an evaluation at the end of the semester, but there's absolutely no reason why these discriminatory things should be used for promotion decisions, certainly. And we talked about service loads, that service loads tend to be higher for women. Again, trying to make this process transparent of who's doing what would go a long way to address that. And promotion policies, which is a little bit tougher if you don't have the representation to kind of help address some of these things at different levels. If we don't have enough female full professors, it's hard to bring up more women in the ranks and kind of address that, but we need to figure out creative ways to do that as well.
Yeah, I want to speak to quickly from the chat, Karen, your comment about when you get in the door, this risk of kind of being seen as difficult. I mean, absolutely, if you are one of, if not, excuse me, the only member of a marginalized or multiply marginalized group, absolutely you run the risk of being seen as difficult for bringing up the walls that you are encountering, that other people are just breezing past because they have no wall there. And so I wanted to echo what Dr. Popovich said. I think the first step is requiring greater transparency about who is doing what, and to the best of our ability, and it will be difficult and it will require us to push back against implicit bias and socialization into these systems. Having the same expectations and responses to everyone, right? So if someone says, I actually can't take that on right now, here are some resources on this topic, but I just can't take this on, to kind of look at, okay, what is this person doing? What is our typical expectation of what someone in this position should be doing? Okay, they are completely correct. They are already at full capacity, so we either need to take something away and put someone else maybe on that committee, or we need to find someone else who can do this work. And I think it's about moving it from individual conversations, where so often if you are a member of a marginalized or multiply marginalized group, you're kind of trained like how to say no without making other people mad, right? For example, this is something that I feel like women faculty members, we talk about all the time. And I mean, that's tremendous, and absolutely we need to have those conversations because it's happening. But I think we also need to bring the conversation kind of out of the behind closed doors current situation where it's between two people, and kind of make it much more visible and much more transparent, so that we not only see the disproportionate level that some people are carrying, but also how many more times they are asked to do things and maybe have to turn people down, and how that is responded to and interpreted by other people compared to others who maybe are not asked, or so I think this visibility is going to be the most important thing. And then just making sure that people in leadership positions are knowledgeable on the fact that these biases are baked in. These structural forms of discrimination are baked in, and so it takes active effort to make sure we are not falling into the trap of perpetuating those expectations, those different expectations for different people, regardless of our own personal beliefs, because the system is set up to support that.
Oh, we're at the end. How did we get to the end already? Well, we have some extra time at the end to have more discussion about, I think, some of these issues. And I love the discussion also of like, how can we try to creatively problem solve some of these things that are, they're difficult. I mean, you really do have to consciously work at them, and everybody has to kind of be on board and on the same page about how do we address these things. And that's not always easy to do. But hopefully some of the key things that you've learned today is that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities. And also that, equality, again, is not the same thing as equity. So even if we do have equal rights and opportunities, there's additional work that we need to do to get to a place of equity. Our brains are hardwired in some maladaptive ways. Think about stress during the pandemic, but also think about this idea of social inclusion. And we want and crave social inclusion, but that doesn't mean we need to think of ourselves as being excluded when certain marginalized groups are advocating for themselves. We need to try to find ways to support them, actually. And so we also need to address implicit bias and the structural inequities that exist in our society, whether that's academia or another workplace, or things like access to childcare, things like access to other resources that people need. And there are some strategies that we could be thinking about in terms of addressing some of these issues, in particular in the academic workplace, because again, that's where our focus is, that's where we live. But if you live in other areas, you can think about ways that hopefully can address those issues there. So with that, I mean, again, we'd love to continue this conversation, have some additional questions, comments, anything you guys want to talk about.
Yeah, so we've about 10 minutes. So this would be a great time if you have anything particular that you either during this process that you didn't understand that you'd like more clarification on, or maybe something that you've been experiencing that you would like to discuss and get, sort of expert feedback on how, from a feminist perspective, how the issue might be addressed, or any of those things. Feel free to send it in the chat or just sort of open your mic and ask a question.
I just wanted to say, to your point, Deidre, something I think about with equity and what's equal is I think often about what's equal is not always fair and what's fair is not always equal. And I think about that a lot because sometimes these people are just striving for equality, and it doesn't mean that it always gets us up to what's fair and what makes up for the lack of equity, for so long. So that's just something that I think about a lot, especially when policies come out where people have a lot of pushback, like, oh, well, that's not equal. And I'm like, well, is it fair though? And is it trying to make up for something? So I just wanted to share that.
Yes, thank you. That's very valuable. We do need to think about how to make up for the lack as well as address the other issues.
Yeah, Erica, I think that's a great point. And I do this in my class, often talk about, and you all kind of discussed it today, I bring up the issue of the mandated gender representation on boards in California. In Norway, clearly has this. Spain, there's a lot of countries that also have this. And I asked them, their thoughts on it, just openly, what are your thoughts? And the initial reaction is often from a majority of the students that it's just not fair. Like, you shouldn't, like, that means that somebody very deserving isn't going to get the position. And I often say, so do you think that everyone sitting on that board right now that all looks exactly the same, all deserve that position more than anyone else did? And so, it's like how to present to them that we have bias in the way that we approach, when our committees on these boards, when our nominating committees sit down to determine who it is they would like to bring on and vote on to be new board members. It's usually people in their circle of individuals that they're constantly seeing. It's the same people we're hiring all the time. So it never does diversify. So if we don't have some sort of external catalyst, right, or some exogenous shock that creates something different, then how will we ever change anything? And so I think that our students in particular, that idea of a structural inequality, they very much struggle with the idea that Eric was saying, that if you make a change, it may not be a fair change, but it's not a fair system, right? We're trying to make it a more fair system by doing something that may not be seen as fair.
Right. And I also don't think you can convince me that the women that will be sitting on that board are somehow less qualified than the men who would be sitting on that board as well. I mean, I think we can address that and say, clearly that's not the case.
Yeah, we have that discussion too.
Well, and I think there's been a lot about even just writing for jobs or like writing the call for those things, how often we're eliminating people that we shouldn't be just by how we ask for people to apply. And so there's been a lot of great research about like, how do we rewrite these things and get away from these like structural inequalities that are fed into all of how we even ask for people to apply for those things. So you can get at that with that.
Yeah, I want to pull in a couple questions that came in. So Lucy, to your question, I think that the role is that absolutely men should be feminists, because we should all hopefully want to live in a world that has more equity for all people, regardless of their gender identity, gender expression, or their, sex assigned at birth. And that certainly, although that should be enough of an argument, right? If we need to have a more self-centered argument, that feminism also will help men in the sense that, these toxic, what Dr. Popovich gestured towards earlier, these toxically masculine expectations and constraints in our society are things that feminism is very concerned with and wants to push back against. And so certainly, just like you just said, I'm not going to be convinced those men or those women aren't as qualified as the men to sit on that board. I'm not convinced that there aren't more men who want to be stay-at-home dads or work in particular industries or, engage with various aspects of femininity or play with an easy bake oven. I'm certainly not convinced that that there is not a huge critical mass of people who feel that they, just don't have that option, because we constrain masculinity so much. And we certainly constrain it much more and police it much more than how we constrain femininity and police people who are supposed to be feminine. And so I think that, the role is advocacy. The role is, self-education. The role is speaking up, particularly when we see those things like, the locker room talk, the things that people will not say in front of women because they must know that it's not actually really a thing you should be saying, right? Those are especially the moments. And then also to uplift the voices of those who are encountering the walls, to say, no, we really need to listen. This is happening, right? Because in our system, we view the people who are in the dominant group, the privileged group, as more reputable about systems of discrimination. We view people who are experiencing the discrimination as biased, despite the fact that people experiencing discrimination, of course, are much more likely to be able to accurately describe it and point it out when it's happening. And so I think those are all of the really crucial roles that men play in feminism.
And then there was another question about what techniques can we use to train our brains to rely less on stereotypes. And I think as the psychologist, I'm supposed to answer that one. So I think, just being aware of these things, I think implicit bias training is helpful for awareness. It brings that base level of awareness, and you can't change something unless you're aware of it. So being aware of, oh, hey, I might have some bias, even though I consider myself to be a pretty, open-minded and curious person, and I interact with a lot of different people and a lot of different types of people. Maybe I still have bias. What could that possibly be? And thinking through like, oh, well, maybe I encountered this person who was a certain race and a bad thing happened, but does that mean that all people of that race are bad? No. And then kind of thinking through some of these issues. So the same thing happens with, other stereotypes like, oh, well, women just want to burn their bras and hate men. Well, is that true? Like, do I know any women who are feminists who don't want to do those things? Right? I probably do. Or so I think we really have to be conscious of the fact that these things exist, that we all have some bias, that we all carry bias around with us, that we all rely on stereotypes because they're quick and easy, and our brains like to have quick and easy things happening. But we really have to stop and say, okay, can I consciously, deliberately think through this and think that this is true and accurate all the time? Probably not. Can I think of some counterexamples? Probably I can, right? But it does take more work to do that, but we should all be doing that. I think, stereotypes come up a lot in the hiring process, right? Oh, she's from so-and-so, she's from a big city. Would she really want to come to Lubbock, Texas? Like, those types of conversations happen all the time where we're making assumptions about people. And we always have to stop the conversation and say, wait, why are we making this assumption? Maybe she would come here. Maybe she wants to leave the city and not deal with traffic anymore, right? So again, coming up with these counterexamples, these like challenging assumptions all the time. And we all have assumptions that we have to keep challenging. I also really like this question about being the token woman in the room. I appreciate that question because I have been the token woman in the room multiple times. Again, going back to hiring, I think it's detrimental that we have these hiring committees where we have one woman on the committee as the token woman. But I do think that it's always a tightrope act, right? Where you're like, okay, I have these assumptions of how I'm supposed to behave. If I go too far in the other direction, it's not going to work well. There's going to be some backlash there. So trying to, I think, manage those expectations with a little bit of, again, pushback or challenging assumptions, or saying, well, wait a minute, let's think about this. How can we approach this differently while not being too confrontational, I think is probably a good way to behave as the token woman, but that's just how I've handled it.
Yeah, I do think this is a very complicated question, particularly in academia, because we do know that there is such underrepresentation of so many minoritized groups. I do think, going back also to the previous question about what can not only just men, but people in the dominant position do, I think one thing is that, look at who's going to be invited. If you're invited to speak on a panel on a particular issue, look around, and if we see that it's all, Andy, I don't remember how you put it, but you put it really well. If everyone looks exactly the same, everyone has the same background and training, and you are a person who is in a dominant group who's more likely to be taken seriously, then that's where you leverage that privilege to be taken more seriously, to say, we have a problem and we need to I'm not going to do this unless we have more viewpoints represented, right? That's one thing you can do. Absolutely, it is hard if you're the only person with your training, if you're the only person with your experience. You end up getting called to be on so many different panels and speak in so many places. That is a big problem. One thing I would say is, don't make people do more work than they need to do. A lot of this research absolutely readily exists places. You do not need to have a round table with a bunch of women, people of color, etc., on their experiences with teaching evaluations to know that teaching evaluations have bias built in, right? That's work that's already been done. And so I would say that's another really important factor is leverage the resources that are available to us already before we ask for people's time. And then when we do use people's time to, especially now that we're in an age where people have used Zoom, hopefully even once we're back to being face-to-face with people, maybe we are more intentional about recording things, or more intentional about just keeping, track of some of those things, some of the work people have already provided for us, to use in other places, is another suggestion I have. And then, finally is to, I think that transparency again on what people are doing and what service people are doing is another really crucial way. If you know that within your department, college, university, whatever it might be, there's a distinct problem of underrepresentation of X, demographic, Y demographic, etc. And you know that in order to be more equitable and work against that at higher levels, you're going to have to rely on certain people to serve more times on search committees, serve more times on tenure and promotion committees, then take other responsibilities away from those people. If that's the most crucial area where you need people, a diverse representation of people most desperately, then be strategic about it. And maybe, maybe it's, I can't think of another example. Maybe it's having the person who's the DUGS, I'm not sure if that's the title here, Director of Undergraduate Studies, maybe that position is something that, we can give to someone who is not as crucially needed to be on these multiple search committees, as an example. But I think the visibility is one really key step.
I think we're probably out of time where it comes. I knew this would be an interesting subject that would probably go down to the wire. I think for me, the key takeaway in all of this is that if you're here and you're interested in understanding things more, then it really is sort of on you to as Dr. Scott and Dr. Popovich both pointed to. I think it's on you to learn more. And I think you should take a greater role within whatever your job and your position are, and whatever areas or positions of power that you might hold, or privileges that you might have. You use those in the most appropriate or most effective way possible. As was stated within the Rawls College, we don't have a lot of female representation, especially when it comes to the tenure track faculty area. And so having a female ability to sit on a P&T committee, to make sure to sit on the committees that are awarding chairs, I sit on just about every committee there is, and it's exhausting. But at the same time, I don't want to slide. I don't want to go backwards from what we've gained. So we need other people to step up. And that is men, and that is white men, and that is other underrepresented groups. But to educate yourselves, not only on issues of feminism, but on issues that are of biases against underrepresented populations in general, so that you can help somehow to move these issues forward in whatever capacity you might have. I think that's where the role that I try and take up as much as possible, understanding the balance between when it's my turn to step in and try and help, and when it's just my turn to be there in a support system, and in whatever way those groups might need me, right, or might want my help, and then I'll do that. So I think educating yourself is important, and coming to things like this is very important. So I want to thank both Dr. Popovich and Dr. Scott for being with us today. It was amazing and excellent and everything and every way I thought possible. So I appreciate your help. I think it's an important topic, as I said. And one of the things that I think I can't remember who said it, but we need leadership who understands these issues. And I do think we're very lucky. I don't think she's here anymore, but Dean Williams has been very supportive in all issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the college. Within, the constraints that are an academic institution. So I hope that continues in the future. And we would appreciate anything, any feedback or additional areas or interests that anybody would like to see in donuts and diversity moving forward. And for everyone outside the Rawls and inside the Rawls, we just want to say thank you for being with us today.